Well, hey there, it's your old pal Keith from wavetables.lol. That's wavetables.lol, home of KRC Mathwaves, my gigantic collection of single-cycle waveforms and wavetables for all modern synthesizers, and they might also be useful with many other synths, potentially including Dawesome Myth. Today, I wanted to take a look at Myth by Dawesome, which is Dawesome's new flagship VST synth. It runs in your DAW. It doesn't have a standalone mode. Not sure if that matters to you or not. It doesn't a lot matter to me. I do like a standalone mode, but we don't have to have one. And I was very excited to hear about Myth. I didn't know about its pre-development. But I found out about it when Sound Author, one of the folks who did some of the patches for the factory collection in Dawesome Myth, was doing a live stream, and I just kind of happened to catch it, and I was like, now this is one of my patches, but I was like, ooh, Sound Author was demonstrating his factory patches, and I was like, "Ooh, those sound like my wavetables." Like, I was like, "Oh, this thing might really float my boat." And then I went to read about it, and I got super excited. Now, I should say, before I continue any further, I have very conflicted feelings about this synthesizer. I will just come right out and say it. I think that certain parts of it are hot garbage, but it's a synth that conceptually is full of a ton of great stuff. And I think it's very exciting. And I did buy it because I wanted my comments today, which is, I guess, more or less a review of the synth with a focus on certain areas and demonstrating certain problems, as well as certain benefits that the system has. I wanted my comments to be in the context of a customer and not just some guy on the internet, because I really want to love this synth, but I think it needs a few things. Anyway, let's talk about the marketing for Dawesome Myth. It's sold via Traction, and it's actually pretty cool. There's a 90-day free trial period, so you get like 3 months to mess around with it for free before you have to pull the trigger on buying it. I think that's, incredibly generous. But here's what they say. Okay, so Myth is the new flagship synthesizer. I'm just reading from here. By Dawesome. So whether you're a beginner or seasoned sound designer, like me, with Myth, you can turn your wildest sound fantasies into reality. Okay, yada yada. Nonlinear synthesis. VA modeling has become the industry standard, blah, blah, blah. Digital filters are linear, while analog filters are nonlinear, and our ears are just so sensitive to this difference. What would happen if you create an entire sound engine with nonlinear processing? What if you could cover the sonic breadth of FM, physical modeling, wavetables, analog, with a single approach and just by tweaking a few knobs? That sounds pretty cool. I mean, there's a lot of silly marketing hype there, but some of it's actually true with respect to the synth. But then here's the thing that really got me excited. Exploit natural variances of samples. In classical synthesis, oscillator waves are mostly static, and you add filters and modulations to program all the variations to make the sound organic and interesting. Well, that's synth programming for you, yeah. Myth offers a paradigm shift. Drag and drop audio, and it will be resynthesized as an iris. The inherent variations and richness of the sample can now be exploited with the transformer dials. And so these are the irises depicted here. We see them. They're always visible in this plugin, so they must be extremely important and useful, eh? And then we've got the transformer dials beneath those. Now, I am a person who has an enormous sample library that, I've built up over many, many years. It's, many terabytes in size, several terabytes of which are on this particular machine I'm working on. And I'm always looking for exciting ways to take my favorite samples or even samples that I'm not a fan of and transmogrify them, right, into something interesting. And so I was super excited about this, and resynthesis is a thing that I've messed around with before. Particularly in the context of KRC Mathwaves. I was working for a time on ways of taking samples and converting them to wavetables in intelligent ways using resynthesis. And it's hard. It's not easy to do. And so I think anytime that there's, a new commercial product that is offering resynthesis, like, I'm excited about it. I know the limitations of resynthesis. Like, you're unlikely to get something resynthesized that sounds exactly like the original sample or source material, right? But we expect, with recent advances in audio and machine learning and elsewhere in the marketing literature for Myth, the implication is made that there's some sort of ML or AI processes going on here with respect to the resynthesis modeling. We have no way of knowing how true that is. But when you're working with this kind of stuff, it is actually, you very quickly get into what I would call machine learning territory, because you do have to sort of, if you're going to take any source sample, right, you have to analyze it. You have to do some sort of statistical processing on it, right? And you typically convert it to some sort of spectral representation, where then potentially, time, pitch, and timbre are things that we can kind of morph independently of each other. And that seems to be one of the ideas behind Myth. Now, the resynthesis as it is in Myth right now is not very good. And I go back and forth between, well, okay, this is within what I would expect from resynthesis bounds, to this thing is hot garbage and I want to throw it out the window. Now, I bought the plugin because it has many other things to recommend it. So it has some really interesting physical modeling modules, and I have several other less generic physical modeling synthesizers. And I'm like, okay, I find this interesting. They're also, the physical modeling components are tunable. You can actually, and this works way better than the irises, you can actually drag and drop samples into them, or you right click and load samples into them and tune the resonators to the frequencies. And so there's a lot of kind of fun exploration we can do around that, and I'll show some of that off. And then there's also a respectable virtual analog synth, and the effects in this thing are great. But if you're coming to Myth with the idea that, ooh, I can take these, some of my coolest or favorite samples and throw them in here and then mess around with them, I'm afraid you're going to be sorely disappointed. So let's just talk, I think, real quickly about conceptually how, at least in the marketing literature, you're maybe supposed to use Myth. So we have these irises, right? So these two things are the irises. And we load them with some sort of sound source, okay? And then that sound source is analyzed and supposedly resynthesized. And at the 12 o'clock position here, let me just play. If you play a note, you can drag the playhead indicator. Let's just shut off modulation for a second. You can see I can drag this playhead indicator and sort of get different areas of the sample. You immediately see one issue is that there may not be big differences across your sample depending on what you have loaded. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But that's the playhead. And so the 12 o'clock position here is both the start and the end of the sample. Okay. And so if we were playing through time, we could advance this to play different portions of the sample. This particular patch is not a great example of this because we don't see any variation across the waveform. And part of the reason for that is what I've loaded in here is a single cycle waveform that's extracted from one of my hundreds of thousands of wavetables that you can get in KRC Mathwaves. It's $29. Go to wavetables.lol and get yours today. Because, I just spent money on Myth, so I need to sell, another 5 or 6 copies of Mathwaves to make up for that. So help me out. Help a brother out. Okay. It's capable of lovely timbres, right? And the factory patches are very heavy on this. There are more than 740 factory patches. That's its own kind of issue. Let's take a look at something else that's a little bit different. So theoretically, right, you can load any sample and then play it back. What I've done here is loaded a flute sample. It's a very breathy, noise chiffy flute, and once it's resynthesized, it sounds like this. Huh? Oh boy, right? Well, it's maybe okay up here in the upper register, but boy, is there like a lot of weird noise, right? Let's go get something else and just kind of show how this resynthesis works. Here's a sample that actually works pretty well. Now this is an old Ensoniq add-on pack sound, and you're actually hearing, if you're thinking in your head that maybe it's September, that's because you recognize this as the voice of Maurice White, the late Maurice White, who was one of the vocalists, of course, in Earth, Wind, and Fire, and was also a master of multi-tracking vocals. I mean, these are some fat stacks of Vox right here. And so this was a really interesting session that Ensoniq did, and they sold this as a premium product. And you can still get these from Digital Sound Factory. Anyway, so there's Maurice, like just a beautiful vocal sound. Let's take that and load it into an iris and just see what happens to it. Now you've heard it, so you know what it sounds like. And I've got Sononym open here. Sononym is a sound I get like a sample librarian and search thing. It's actually really useful. Waves, I think, has a free thing that's kind of like this. I like it a lot. If you have a giant sample library, you need something like Sononym to keep your sanity. And you can just drag and drop a wave file onto one of the irises, and you'll see we do our resynthesizing here. It's kind of weird. It takes a different amount of time for different samples, and it doesn't seem to depend on their length, which is both odd and maybe concerning to me. And then once you've got your sample and iris, you can play it back. And now you're wondering, okay, can I make the playhead so that it's in sync with the original length of the sample? You can. And this is actually covered in one of the tutorials. There are built-in tutorials with Myth, which I think is actually great. So you can start a tutorial. It says start here. It'll take you through like all of kind of the basic functions of the interface. I'll talk about a lot of these today too, I think. But I thought that was really nice. Like, that's really great. And it looks like you can even record. You can create new tutorials. And so that's one thing I thought might be useful about this synth, is it could be useful for teaching people about, various aspects of synthesis, right? Because the tutorials are neat. You can like make new modules appear and yada, yada, yada. It's pretty cool. But we were talking about getting the timbral information kind of back in sync with the timing of the sample, right? The sample is that long. And so if we wanted to play it back at exactly that rate, what we do is we can right click on it and do create and use new LFO. And so what this does is this will create a ramp LFO for us where the timing is like the original sample. So that'll get us closer to what we feel like we imported. Now, when you compare that to this, there's the root note. What's missing? Well, it's like we lose things like chorusing, I think. Although a lot of the timbral information is there, and it's cool that pitch and time are now disconnected, right? As I play up the keyboard, that playhead doesn't have to play faster for this thing to stay in tune. And of course, this isn't a complete patch yet, right? We don't have effects on this. We're not doing any filtering. We're not doing any other clever modulations. One thing you'll notice is that when we right-click and do create and use new LFO, this new LFO by default is set to loop, which in many cases will not be what you want. And so when you're looking at that LFO, you just click on it. It's LFO 5 here now. You can unclick loop. Modulators can be polyphonic in Myth, so that's cool. So you see that the line indicates a playing note, and that's the playhead going around, right? So, I mean, that could be the basis for a great sound, right? There's a lot of super interesting modules in this. There's all sorts of FM and FM, AM, and ring modulation and frequency shifting alike things that you can do to each of the irises. There's a big focus on distortion and creative distortion, including an emulation of a weird device called the Atari Punk, which I remember from back in the day. You can add really crazy sounding distortions to things. And I do think that one of the reasons that there's a lot of... You can turn things on and off too by just clicking their little button here. I do think one of the reasons that there's a lot of distortion modules in here is because the iris already does so much distortion to imported samples. Now, believe it or not, what we're hearing here, this is actually when the resynthesis works well. And we can turn this into a bigger patch. Let's go over here to Maurice Oo 3. I mean, there's a lot of pretty stuff you can do here, right? But that's like a successful import. Let's look at types of material that do not work well. So this is a sample from one of the equipped music collections. And you'll note if you hover over an iris down here in the bottom where the question mark is, watch. See, it tells you at least the file name for what fed this. So this was EQ chord 339. It's a chord called buffer. I can tell you, it doesn't sound like this at all for real. We could go to try to find it, actually. It'll take a minute for Sononym to find that. But we'll find the original and we'll play it. You can hear that there's all this graininess that happens, right? And you can hear that very kind of spectral, we're resynthesizing something, perhaps with resonators kind of quality. And that's not necessarily such a terrible thing. You can also hear that noise that happens. And I don't know if this resynthesis engine is actually trying to model the noise at all, or if noise just kind of screws up the harmonic analysis of the sound. I kind of think it's the latter. Let's see if we've got buffer yet. Have we found buffer? There it is, 339 chord buffer. Here's what it sounds like originally. It's a total chill out, kind of hip hop, throw it in your SP1200 thing, right? And so you can hear that I'm playing it back a lot slower. Again, I could do the trick if I want to get back to its kind of original time base. I could do create and use new LFO. And then now this LFO will be timed similar to how the original sample goes. And you hear that now that once we do that, it's like we're missing some of the high frequency content and maybe some of the body, but it's not terrible. Now, the idea behind the irises is that theoretically, instead of using traditional filters and modulators and stuff, you would use these transformers down here to transform the sound. And then you might also not modulate the sound with an LFO to play through it, but maybe we just want to use portions of it. Let's undo that modulation. Maybe we just want to use portions of it as a source, right? And so now we've got a static playback head, and we can select different regions of the sound. That volume might be a little low there. But you hear that this is what I mean when I say hot garbage, right? Like, every position in this sounds like a poorly looped sample, right? There's discontinuities sort of all over the place, and so it almost sounds like the waveforms that it's producing, like, you know, aren't aligned. Like there's a snap, right? And like it sounds just like a poorly set loop point. And these can sound quite harsh. Now, one way that we can try to eliminate that, there's all these modifiers. So these two right here are for doing FM. We'll get into that a little bit. And if you look down here at the question mark, there's a tooltip that tells you what this thing is. So this is kind of like an amount of frequency modulation. This is a frequency modulation ratio. We can use this transformer to add inharmonic frequencies. I feel like we have a lot of inharmonic frequencies here already, but let's listen to it. You know, so you can fuck shit up. Okay, so now this gets into territory, right? Where maybe, I mean, it's very disharmonic, I would say. Now, that we could use as an oscillator for subtractive synthesis, right? We could run that through a filter. And the philosophy here in the transformers is that you've got these little colored dots down here that actually you can modulate them and you can expand them to be bigger. We'll talk about this one first. So this transformer basically like filters out, or basically stops playing like the higher harmonics until it gets more toward the fundamental. So listen to this. So you see, we eventually get down to something that's sort of sine wavy in this case, rather than being very busy like that. So I guess theoretically, this is supposed to be, you know, you could use this like a filter, but, you know, that doesn't have a very pleasing sound, right? But you could, for example, take this, you could move it all the way up, and then we could add some modulator to it. The modulation is interesting. In Myth, there are basically no preset modulations. So there is no synth architecture. That is both interesting, but it's also problematic. I'll probably talk about it a little bit. So we could drag out an ADSR and let's like give it a little like AD kind of shape, right? And then we'll modulate this guy back down. So that's the Iris's idea of filtering. Now I know what you're saying. You're saying, well, that's not really an acceptable alternative to a cool sounding filter, is it? And no, it's not. Let's get this back in a different position. Okay. So it's already phony to say, oh, you'll just spend all your time messing around in the iris, right? These modifiers, these transformers, like, are interesting, but they're not a replacement for a modeled filter. Now, they didn't talk about these ones, and I want to get away from this ugly sound, so we'll talk about those more in a minute. But there's also, there's this modifier that makes things quote unquote more saw-like. So I assume that means that we're increasing every harmonic until we get to that 1/n shape that a sawtooth wave would have. That in itself is a little like a filter sweep, right? Like if we were down here. So you see, you can you can get timbral transformations, but they're not always very pleasing. This one changes it says it mangles the phase and produces a string-like timbre. And then the next one is brass, I think, yeah. Accentuates brass-like harmonics. And then this one makes things more square-like, which I assume to mean it's bringing all of the odd harmonics up until they match the timbral character of a square wave. This is one of the most interesting ones. It says it's similar to classic oscillator sync. It actually creates resonances. So kind of in combination with some of these other modifiers, you can get resonant filter effects. There's also, now I don't know why you'd want to do this because this thing is already dirty and noisy enough, right? But there is this guy who is a dirt and noise generator. Now, one thing that is interesting is that it's only the parts of the resynthesized sample that have volume that actually get the noise, and this does have a use. It does have a use when we're talking about physical modeling, which we'll kind of get to. All right, so that's what the transformers are about, and this is kind of what you can expect when you drag random samples in, especially if a sample has like pitch changes, or it has it's chordal, or there's noise. Like you might think that a flute sample would and
nothing can stop it.
Okay. You might think that a flute sample would be good here, but I find that the noise kind of screws things up. Rather than import one, let me just go back to this flute, and let's see. We'll turn off our oscillator. I'll talk about OS1 and OS2 and filter, etc. Let's dial this noise back. So that's our flute that came in, and so in the very high registers, you do hear, I mean, okay, there's the sine wave, essentially, that is the flute, but the chiffy noise at the beginning has just kind of become this crunchy mess. And so one thing that is useful with Myth is that there is physical modeling. And so we've got this kind of flute-shaped sample, but it sounds like garbage, right? So what we could do is we could just use it as a noise source. So I could turn up this noise oscillator, and now I've got a flute chiff-shaped noise. And if instead of just playing this noise back, I routed it through some modal units. So modal is a resonant, it's like a frequency, what am I trying to say? A resonator bank filter, and it's tunable. So you can actually, there's a whole bunch of built-in resonances that actually sound really good. And this filter bank is tuned to the pitch of the key that you're playing. There is also, in addition to modal, there's a static resonant filter called resonance. Where is it? Resonator. It shows up here as reso rather than resonator. And so reso is the same thing, but it's static. And you can load, I'm going to remove that. You can load your own waveforms in here to tune the resonators, which is super interesting. But let's just listen to this. So now instead of really hearing that noise, we're hearing, now again, this isn't a very harmonically fun sound, but you can see that we're exciting a resonator now, so you can do physical modeling things. And then I believe that in this version, I kind of brought this more to life. There's a lot more adjustments going on. that's a physical modeled flute shift, right? So you can do stuff like that. And I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, you got to be in the mood to do physical modeling, but that's an application that maybe makes Smith worth the money, even though the iris thing I think it's kind of a joke at this point. What I really want, let's get it out there, Keith. What I really want is a sample module in here, right? It doesn't have to be fancy, but like let me play back my samples like without mangling them through the iris and use all of these wonderful filters and effects that Myth has. Like that would be super great. Another thing I noticed as I was, comparing the original versions of samples to their resynthesized representations is that it's actually kind of an interesting effect to have the original sample and then have the resynthesized one underneath it, like maybe radically pitch shifted or resonated in some way. That would give this synthesizer like a completely different sound that no other synth does. Like right now, it does do some sounds that no other synth does, but it's because it's doing some things very poorly, I think. How long have I been going? As I'm constantly saying, oh boy, 30 minutes already. I have more to say about this. I'm going to take a short break, which you won't notice, and refresh my beverage, and then we'll talk more about Myth. And I don't know, we'll talk about where it's more successful, okay? Rather than being a complete negative Nancy, I do want to talk about some of the things that I think Myth does really well. And one thing is it has an extremely enjoyable to read user guide. That kind of gets you excited about stuff. And again, it kind of oversells the iris thing. But also it's got handy links where you can reveal the preset directory, the factory directory, because it is easy to get lost. There are some factory samples to import and make irises from, and things that you can use in the resonators and stuff. And so you can do all of that stuff. You can scale the interface. I've got it in giant mode because, I have old eyes and a high-res screen. And actually, I was not, God, complain. One of the things that really bummed me out, like before I even kind of got fed up with the iris thing, was that there was a bug in the first release of Myth where the right-click menus did not scale, and so you literally could not read them if you're me. And so I'm like, oh wow, this thing is like painful to work with because I can't see. Like, I can't differentiate the different filters and stuff. It was very annoying, but that's been fixed as of today. So that's great. So there's a developer behind this. Peter, the guy from Dawesome, is obviously interested in improving it. And so that's really good. The user guide is good. It has a link to open it up there. I'm going to open it up. It's a little PDF manual. And it's actually kind of fun to read. And it's got nice links to like all the different modules. This actually is actively being updated. And I note that it was updated today with, I guess, some new descriptions for some of the modules. It's just kind of nice. It explains all the things. Again, there's also tutorials that you can go through. There's even like funny stuff. Like there's a joke in here. There's a module that actually it's described, but it's not described. It's like, it's secret sauce. And so it just has a silly story behind it. So it's very cool. So this is like really good. This is good, especially because, as I mentioned, there's no architecture. It's a completely modular architecture. And so whatever modulations you want to set up on the downside, you have to set up them yourself. But on the plus side, like if you don't need a filter for a given patch, like this one doesn't have a filter, it has resonators. There's not extraneous, modulations for like filter cutoff and things like that. So, that's a double-edged sword. There is one thing that is built in is there's this concept of 3 expression modifiers. And so this is designed to use things like MPE controllers and things like Osmos that send expression. And so depending on your controller, you can have it set up so that E2, E1, E2, and E3 like do different things. They're kind of like built-in macros. And then there's 4 customizable macros, so you can have a single parameter that controls a bunch of other parameters. So that's pretty interesting, and I think that's really smart. Now, all that being said, there are a whole bunch of factory patches. I'm not going to point at anybody. Let's just grab one at random. Oh, this one doesn't even use the irises, see? This is one of Dawesome's own patches, and this is like a VA patch. So instead of using the irises, it's using in OS1, and actually it's not using OS2. In OS1, it's using this sawtooth generator. And it has some great choruses. So, you know, under effect, there's this one called Sweet. Let's like swap this out for Sweet. I don't know if we'll hear this. I mean, you can push that really hard, but great sounding effects, right? And then things like OTT, right, which is a multiband compression type of unit. There's modeled filters that are great. So there's a dedicated low-pass filter module, but then there's also a multi-mode filter with a bunch of different modes, right? So bandpass 12, bandpass 24, there's notches, right? They can track or not track the keyboard. That's built in. They have pretty cool sounding resonance. There's another Sweet module here. The effects are great. So like this particular patch, it has a delay on it, and it has ping pong mode as well. They can be tempo synced. There's a granular module. And actually right now we're not hearing it. Let's turn up the wet for the grains. It's beautiful sounding grain stuff. See, I want to run my unmolested samples through this shit, you know? And then there's several different reverbs. There's a shimmer reverb, which there's so much going on in this patch we may not really hear the effect of this, but there's a shimmer. There is the reverb module that was there originally, and that's like kind of modeled after 80s hardware units. And then there's a cloud reverb that can go extremely long. Like you can get kind of infinite decays. And all of this stuff is described in the manual, and like a lot of these little modules, they're like kind of little plugins in and of themselves, and they're inspired by their plugins, and Peter tells you about like what he was thinking about these. You know, all of this is too great to waste on just grainy resynthesis. And so at least we have like, you know, a good sounding VA modules and also physical modeling. I mean, this is just out of control, right? But where I was going with this, before I did a tour of some things I liked, I wanted to talk about, you know, so the lack of built-in modulations actually kind of leads to lazy patch development. And this is a little bit something that that John Skippy Lemcool was getting into this last weekend. So over the weekend, Skippy did a live stream on YouTube. He's, Plugin Guru. And so John Lemcool is a guy who's done factory voicings for a shit ton of synthesizers, but including famous things like the Korg Wave Station, as well as the update, the Wave State. Like he's the guy who wrote Ski Jam, like a classic Wave Station patch, and he makes great plugins and sample packs and stuff now, and I think typically does a Saturday live stream. But he talked about Myth and also a new plugin called Battalion, and he was like, his advice to Myth was like, you know, it's okay to have like, you know, all these different sound designers like contributing the patches and stuff, but there needs to be a a curated collection, right? And you need to make sure that you're voicing the factory patches like cover all the bases, and that they really show off the best of what the synth can do. And not all of these things are gems, okay? The other thing you see is you can kind of tell that the sound programmers who are working with this thing were, like me, struggling a little bit with the whole iris concept, and so there's a lot of these floaty pad things that take advantage of the effects because it's the only way to kind of disguise just some of the horrific like lo-fi resynthesis stuff that's going on. Horrific is maybe a little much. But one thing you'll notice is because there's not a predefined modulation system, there are no shortage of patches that don't even use velocity to modulate the amp envelope. And that's just lazy patching, right? Because there should almost always be some amplitude modulation on your amp envelope amount, right? And so just to demonstrate modulation really quick, so let's fix this one. There's an amount for the envelope here, and what we would do is we would set this somewhere low, and then we go to velocity and we drag that up, and now we're adding a positive velocity modulation to the amp envelope amount. And now I can play loud, or I can play soft. There's something else modulating amount, it looks like to me. I'm not sure where that's happening. Anyway, not my patch, right? Anyway, I'll link to that live stream replay because his comments on Myth are very interesting. Also, I don't think he spent as much time with the synth as I did. I mean, he's got a lot of other synths to kind of work on and do stuff with. And so I think he was like, okay, this is no. But his comments were a lot kinder than mine. Like, he didn't call anything hot garbage. Now, when the resynthesis works, and it tends to work on things that aren't too noisy, that are single instruments, don't have a lot of chorusing or whatever, so like kind of a raw instrument sample. Like, here's a vibraphone sample it's from Easy Listening sample library. And over in Iris 2, I actually have an unaffected version of it, really. If we turn our effects off real quick. So that's how this got imported, and this sounds just like the original sample. So the resynthesis engine is successful with certain types of things, but they're very specific. And so you see a lot of the factory patches, and kind of my advice, if you want to play with these things in the way that the documentation and the marketing material suggests, is you just start with a sine wave or with something like this. But you can see how this makes you want the resynthesis engine to be better, because this is pretty cool, right? That now time and pitch are disconnected. And of course, we could do this in other ways, like there are, like in Contact, there are modes, right, where time is preserved. But this is cool because vibraphones have that, right, right? They have that tremolo on them. And see, the speed of the tremolo does not change as I play different pitches. Which is something to be desired, right? But unfortunately, it just doesn't work in all cases. So back to that patch I was playing in the intro. One thing that's kind of interesting, it felt to me for a while until I experimented more, that you could in fact drag single cycle waveforms onto the iris or import them by doing choose audio source. But they don't always come over exactly right. Sometimes they're reproduced exactly as they would be in some sort of single cycle waveform type oscillator or in a wavetable. But other times they're not. And in fact, this iris was created via one of my exponential sawtooth waveforms from KRC Mathwaves. And if we were to take all of the modulations off of this guy, you would hear it sounds nothing like a sawtooth wave. So it's not really being interpreted right. Also, it's only a single cycle, so why should there be any change over the life of the iris? But you can see from the different colors here that there are some timbral variations that the engine interpreted. My point about that, sorry, I'm probably losing you a little bit, is that you can see and hear in this patch, so this iris was created with one of my polygonal waveforms. And so the polygonal waveforms have this very specific bell-like timbre. It's like supernaturally bell-like. And I know this waveform very well, not just because I'm its daddy, but because I use it a lot in programming. And Myth will play this back perfectly. And then, it's run through a bunch of effects and stuff. You can hear the shimmer verb and the regular reverb, also the grains effect going on here. But this core sound, it's reproducing this single cycle waveform perfectly, but then other times you don't get that. So there's a version here where I imported one of my Dawesome waveforms, not a wavetable. You can try to import wavetables too. They will similarly give you these weird results that do not actually map to the wavetable at all. If you're lucky, there will be some sections of the iris that are similar to the waveforms in the wavetable, but I saw one of the sound designers who contributed patches to Myth, has a little YouTube video about using Serum to create wavetables to bring into Myth. And it's while you can do that, the results of the analysis of that wavetable will typically have nothing to do with the content of it. So just, again, with the irises, it's long samples don't work, complex samples don't work, short samples don't work, wavetables don't work. It's just the people are just thrashing around for content, right? It's okay, maybe we should just have a different way of playing samples in here. What do you think about that? Or maybe it needs hints, when you import something, maybe we could tell it something about the content so that it would do a better job in its resynthesis. I don't know. But it's a little bit crazy. But like I say, like I showed earlier, when it works, it's oh, this is really cool. And then you're oh, it's kind of fun. But it doesn't always work. So this sounds nothing like one of my Dawesome waveforms. You probably can't even hear it. It's fairly low sounding. And, one problem could be, there's no filter. One problem could be the interpretation of the octave, but I don't think so. Tuning is here. Yeah, no. It's just, this is nothing. This spectral representation is nothing like the original waveform, which would sound like some sort of format, but all we got here is basically a sine wave. We could turn it all the way to sine wave. Yeah, it's a sine wave with just some tiny overtones. No, not that this is crappy. I mean, it's a nice little high-pitched sound, but it's all that resynthesis just for this? Whatever. Now, once you do have something like this, you can do FM on it. And the approach to FM is pretty interesting. So there's basically a single sine wave that can be frequency modulated by the iris. And so this control is the amount, and this is modulatable, and then this is the frequency. So that's kind of cool. Also, I didn't talk about this control. This control is very nice. It's called Animate. And what it does is it goes higher. It basically adds some detuning. And if you go very high, you kind of get the sound pitched down an octave and mixed in. Undo the frequency modulation. Okay, so anyway, you're starting to get the idea. What else did I want to show here? Other examples of I guess, content that did import okay. So certain piano samples will. No, that's not too lousy. You know, with some work, right? This is not a complete patch. It's really just the iris right now. You know, with some key tracking on certain things, and, you know, we might change the speed of this LFO as we go higher up the keyboard. Like, you could make kind of an interesting physically modeled piano from this. I'm also using this timbral shift transformer that we have over here. You can see as I move it, it changes the colors. Basically, it's kind of moving between the four engines that are doing the resynthesis. So apparently, I mean, I'm guessing it must be like a low, medium, high, and high. You can hear we get to different parts of the timbre in our sample. This one blurs things out on mostly, I think, across amplitude. And so anyway, these four engines, they have multi-segment envelope generators that you can't get to except for here, that are shaping the amplitude over time. So the amplitude tracking, by the way, it seems to be very accurate. Like if you import, should we try a vocal sample?
And nothing can stop it.
Like this is gonna, okay. That's so cheese. I don't know what that's from. That must be an Ensoniq sample. All right. So nothing can stop us, right? Nothing can stop this. So now we've loaded this cheesy sample called Buffer 2. Thing can stop it. Weird, right? If I right click, do create and use new FO, I could get the timing back. So you can hear actually, right, that the amplitude tracking is right on. But you can't, if you didn't know what this was saying, you probably wouldn't guess. You know, so okay, so that's kind of weird. Like maybe that would be useful, but it's like, yeah, come on. That's not really what we want from this, right? Okay, so there's another example of it. In the case of a piano, it can resynthesize it okay. In the case of a vocal sample, you're going to get something very weird. A little bit more, maybe, I guess, about physical modeling. So one thing that you can do, and I guess I showed this with the flute sample, but let's turn off our effects and turn off the oscillator modifiers. This started as a flute sample. So again, if I were to turn off the looping on the LFO here, it's like a shoot. It's like two breathy flute pulses. It's not terrible how they got interpreted, but it's pretty noisy, right? And so this seems like it would be more useful, to my mind, as an exciter in physical modeling. And so we can take the dirt transformer, turn it all the way up, and just turn that into noise, right? Where there's a little bit of timbre still there. And then in OS1. So OS1 means modifiers that apply to Iris 1. And then OS2 is modifiers that apply to Iris 2 if Iris 2 is present. And then both of those oscillators are mixed down to a filter module. And the interesting thing is like actually the oscillator sections can contain most of the filter modules. So you don't even have to use the filter section, but you can treat things completely differently. There's things like gain modules and a router module that lets you shunt audio to the output before processing some other segment of the audio. Very, very interesting modular stuff. It's probably worthy of its own tutorial rather than my gripe overview here. But what we can do with this, right, is now use that noise source to excite a resonator. So we're using the Modal resonator. This is the one that tracks pitch. And so this is kind of like a strum sound, right? Oops, got to turn our loop back on over here. We probably don't want that to be polyphonic. So there are very interesting physical modeling things that you can do with Myth, and then combined with effects, can potentially be very evocative and fun. So that's a neat thing to do. The other thing I did here is this modal thing, like I showed before, it has all these kind of resonances. These are just wave files that are found in a certain directory. I suspect if I dumped more of my own in there, they would also show up, but they may not scroll. But you can just drag and drop content onto here, samples, and it turns out that single cycle waveforms, like the ones that you get in KRC Mathwaves, actually work really well. So this is the sample I have loaded in here to tune the resonators is called BRM8, and that's one of these binary ring modulation waveforms from the original KRC Mathwaves collection. If we were just to go grab one at random, we would get other results, but this was like a really neat surprise. The BRM waveforms are actually, in some cases, not that complex, so I found it very interesting, the effect of tuning this resonator with it, and there's a lot to explore here. So you can just go, choose wave, and we could just do all sorts of things. Like we could grab a noise waveform and just see what happens there. Let's try another one. Let's go lower. So there's a lot you can explore here with respect to physical modeling that is very interesting if you're in the mood. Now, you may not feel at a given moment like working on physical modeling stuff. It is a different pursuit than other types of synthesis, but it's cool that it's here, and you can do all sorts of effecty and instrumenty stuff. And this is a very simple patch. Okay, is there anything else like really important I wanted to cover? So we saw how the Maurice White ooh sound like actually imported pretty well. This doesn't hold true for aahs. Like aahs do not get represented well, and one of my favorite sounds in the world is the choir sound from I'm Not in Love. And believe it or not, this iris was created with that sample of that ah loop that's used in I'm Not in Love by 10cc, and you can sort of tell that there's an ah going on there. It doesn't help where you start. It doesn't help where you start the iris with this one. It's just awful, right? It's like, what am I gonna do with that? Oh well, whatever. Again, give us proper sample playback. Oh, the other thing I was gonna say, just kind of, I think, advice to Dawesome. Think about a sample player, and think about a player that supports a good multi-sample format. Like, Convert with Moss supports Korg's multi-sample format that they use in WaveState and ModWave. And they have a sample builder, right? That is software for creating multi-samples, and it just, it generates these Korg multi-sample files that, contain all the information for the multi-sample. Like that would be a really easy way to support multi-samples. And then Myth could have like drum kits and stuff, right? It would be much more like a workstation, right? Because you would have multi-sample playback, but you could also have multi-samples that have, different drum hits or effects on them and stuff like that. And that would be like a whole new capability that would open up all these awesome filters and effects to sample playback. Anyway, I think I kind of went through all this stuff before. This is what happens when you just modulate one of the individual transformers. So this is actually modulating the string one. And the seed for this is just the sine wave iris, which is the default in the init patch. But it sounds pretty brassy to me. We could just assign that to different things and hear what the effect of these things are when they're modulated. So this is the brass modulator. We're just taking an envelope here, right? And we're increasing the value of this parameter. All right, and then this one is square. Now, okay, that's interesting and useful, right? But this is nothing you can't do with wavetables, and you're kind of stuck with this. The other thing that's sort of interesting, I guess you would see, the demo's free, and it's free for 90 days. Go check it out. If you load other single cycle waveforms in here, you'll find that these modifiers may not respond as well as they do to the sine wave one. So it's really weird. It's just very weird. And then this is the sync type of change transformer. Whoa. See, it makes resonances, right? Now that's okay, that's kind of respectable. Like, okay, we could do something with that, but I mean, it's just a sine wave getting a sync applied to it. Like, we don't need resynthesis to do that, right? That's kind of weird. I think I am done. Anyway, Myth. I think it's polarizing. Try it out. It's not a preset machine, I would say. I think the presets are very specific. There's not a lot of bread and butter presets, but if you like physical modeling, if you like nice sounding VA stuff, and if you can overlook the fact that there's this kind of large bucket of fail staring you in the face all the time as you use it, which you may or may not get a lot of use out of, then it's an interesting synth. Like I said, I bought it. I'm supporting Dawesome so that I can make these complaints as a customer. Hey, and we learned a little bit about physical modeling today, right? And some ways that we could, if we chose to, use KRC Mathwaves with this product. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, I spent money on this, so please go buy KRC Mathwaves at wavetables.lol. It's your old pal Keith signing off for now. I will talk to you later. Bye.